The rain had been falling since before first light. Not hard rain, the quiet kind that settles into the mud and stays, that turns a dirt street to something closer to river bottom, and makes every step a small negotiation. By mid-morning, the main street of Harlan's Crossing had emptied of anyone without pressing business, and the pressing business had pulled its hat low and moved fast between doorways. He did not move fast. He came in from the east end of the street, walking at the same pace a man walks when he has already been wet for an hour and has stopped thinking about it. A canvas saddlebag over one shoulder, a bedroll under the other arm, wrapped tight enough that only the edges had gone dark with water. His coat was the color of old creek mud, and it hung on him with the particular weight of something that had dried and soaked through many times over. He was not young. He was not old. He was the age a man gets to when he has done enough that it shows in the way he carries himself. No urgency, no performance, just forward motion. The cookhouse sat at the east end of the general store, annexed to it by a short covered passage that kept some of the weather out. A lamp burned in the window. He looked at it for a moment before he pushed the door open. Inside, 4 long benches, a plank counter, the smell of something salted and cooked through. A wood stove in the corner, putting out real heat. He stood in the doorway long enough to let his eyes adjust, then moved to the far end of the bench, the end farthest from the door, and from the 2 men eating at the near end who did not look up. He set his saddlebag on the floor between his feet, set the bedroll against the wall behind him, put both hands flat on the counter. She came out from the kitchen side without looking at him first, the way a person moves through a room they know well enough not to think about. She had a cloth folded over one arm. Her hair was pinned back from her face. Not neatly, the way a woman pins it when she has already been working for 3 hours, and neatness stopped mattering around 6 in the morning. She looked at him then. Not a long look, just enough. He said he would take a coffee. She did not write it down. She went back through the kitchen door, and he put his hands in his lap and watched the wood stove. She came back with the coffee and a plate. Beans, salt pork, 2 pieces of cornbread. She set the plate in front of him, and the coffee beside it, and turned before he could speak. He looked at the plate for a moment. Then he picked up the fork. No one in the cookhouse said anything at all. The cookhouse had been hers for 4 years. Before that it had been theirs, and before that it had been his idea, her husband, a quiet man who had come to Harlan's Crossing to work the general store and ended up building the cookhouse addition off the east wall because he said she cooked too well for only 2 people to eat it. That was the kind of man he had been, practical in his tenderness. He had not said, "I love you so much," as he had said, "There is room for 12 at that counter, and you are wasting something." He had died of fever in the spring of 1877, 4 days after the ice went out of the creek. She had kept the cookhouse open the following Monday because there was nothing else to do with her hands at 5 in the morning, and she had kept it open every weekday morning since. The bent iron nail was his. It was set into the wall just inside the door, at a height that suited a tall man's hat. He had put it there the first winter, hammered it in crooked, and then bent it level with his thumb, and it had held ever since. She had stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing a thing that has always been exactly where it is. It was part of the wall. It was part of the shape of the room the way the wood stove was, or the long pine counter, or the smell of coffee that had soaked into the wood so deeply she believed it would outlast her. She had one rule in the cookhouse. She had never needed to write it down, had never said it aloud to anyone, had arrived at it sometime in the 2nd year after she stopped being surprised by the men who came through and the things they were carrying that they could not set on the counter. The rule was simple. She did not ask a man where he came from, and she did not ask him where he was going. Men on the move were skittish about those questions. She had learned that the way you learn a thing you didn't study, by watching what happened to a man's shoulders when someone asked. She had other rules about coffee, about credit, about noise after the lunch hour. But that one she kept for its own sake, separate from the practical ones. The man at the far end of the counter ate steadily and without waste. She could see him from the kitchen door if she stood at the right angle, which she did not do deliberately. She was simply in that part of the kitchen, reaching for the tin beside the stove, and he was visible. He ate the cornbread last. He held the coffee cup in both hands when he was not drinking it. He did not look around the room the way a man does when he is measuring a place. He looked at the stove. He had been 18 when he stopped having a place to return to. Not because something drove him out. That was the part that was difficult to explain. The part he had stopped trying to explain somewhere around his 25th year. There had been no disaster, no debt, no trouble with the law, no woman who had broken something that couldn't mend. He had simply finished a season's work on a cattle drive outside of Pueblo, been handed his pay, and stood in the road afterward, with nowhere that pulled at him more than anywhere else. So he had walked in the direction that seemed most like forward, and he had kept doing that for 20 years. He had worked good land and bad land. He had spent a winter in a line shack north of Cheyenne, with nothing but a tin stove and a quarter cord of wet wood. He had eaten well in some seasons and poorly in others, and had made peace with the difference. He had learned to read the sky, to read the condition of a horse, to read the mood of a bunkhouse in the first few minutes of walking into one. He had learned these things the way a man learns what he needs to learn when there is no one else to know it for him. He carried a tin cup with a dent on the left side, put there by a stone kicked up from a mule's hoof somewhere outside Trinidad in the summer of 1874. He had kept the cup. It still held coffee. That was enough. He did not think of himself as a man looking for anything. That had not been the shape of it, or at least not a shape he had been able to see from the inside. He moved because staying required a reason, and reasons required roots, and roots required. He was not sure what they required. Something he had not yet found himself in possession of. The rain had let up by morning. The mud on the main street of Harlan's Crossing had firmed into ridges overnight, and the cold that came with the clearing sky gave the air a particular quality, flat and clean and still. He washed his face from the pump behind the livery and made his way back down the plank walk before the town had fully opened its eyes. The cookhouse door was unlocked. The smell of coffee hit him first, then biscuits, something different from yesterday's cornbread, something with a little fat worked into it. The woman was already at the stove, her back to the door, her movements the same as the morning before, deliberate, unhurried, without any motion that was not necessary. He sat at the far end of the bench. She did not turn around to look. She set a cup on the counter without being asked, plain and direct, the same way she'd done everything else, and went back to what she was doing. He put both hands around the cup. The stove ticked softly in the quiet. The fourth morning was the same as the third, and the third had been the same as the second. He arrived before the town was properly awake. She was already at the stove. The cup appeared on the counter without his asking. He sat at the far end of the bench and put his hands around it and let the warmth work into his knuckles, while the light outside the window moved from gray to pale gold. He did not speak. She did not speak. The stove ticked. A horse shifted somewhere in the livery. The morning settled around them like something that had been waiting for permission. On the fifth day it rained again, a light drizzle that beaded on his coat and ran off the brim of his hat. She had something different on the stove. Salt pork cut thinner than usual, and potatoes, and a kind of fried bread he didn't know the name for. She set it in front of him without comment. He ate it all. On the sixth day, the sun came back and stayed. The seventh morning he was on the bench when the boy arrived. He was 9, maybe 10, with his father's coloring and a gap in his front teeth that gave his whole face an open quality, like a door left ajar. He was the livery owner's son. He came in every weekday morning. The woman had told no one this, but it was plain from the way she had his cup ready before he sat down. and from the way he took his seat at the near end of the bench with the ease of someone who knows exactly where he belongs. The boy looked at Caleb's bedroll, propped against the wall near the door where he left it each morning. He said, "That yours?" The man looked at it. "Yes." "You sleep outside with it?" "Sometimes. I've got a room at the boarding house now." "What's it like, sleeping outside?" The man considered the question the way he considered most things, without hurry, without any interest in performing an answer. "Cold in winter," he said. "All right in summer if there's no rain. You learn to read the sky." The boy thought about this with visible seriousness. "My pa says you can tell rain by how the horses act." "Your pa's right." That was all. The boy turned back to his breakfast. The man finished his coffee. There was nothing performed in any of it. The woman, at the far side of the counter, had her eyes on the pan she was working. But she had heard. She heard the way the man's voice stayed level, not flattened to avoid the boy, not lifted to charm him, just level, honest, the same register he would have used with anyone. She moved the pan to the cooler part of the stove and said nothing, and noted it the way she noted most things. Once, clearly, and without deciding yet what it meant. The seventh morning came in gray and still, the kind of cold that had forgotten it was nearly May. She had the stove going before first light, the beans from the night before, reheated, a fresh pan of cornbread, the coffee on early, the way she always did it, without thinking about who would come or when. The boy arrived before the man did. He came in stamping mud from his boots, unwinding a scarf from around his neck, already talking before the door had fully closed behind him. "His name's Caleb," he said. "The drifter man. I asked Pa, and Pa asked Jim Hadley at the boarding house." She was pouring coffee into a cup. She did not turn around. "Is it?" she said. "Caleb." The boy said it again, satisfied with himself, the way a boy is when he has done a thing he considers useful. He climbed onto the bench and settled in, and waited for his breakfast. She set his plate down in front of him, went back behind the counter. Outside, the mud on the main street had stiffened overnight into ridges and furrows. She could see it through the narrow window above the wash basin. A crow was working along the edge of the general store's porch, looking for something. The door opened. She did not look up. She reached for the coffee pot and poured a cup and set it at the end of the counter, the far end, where he always sat. She set it down before he reached the bench. He stopped for just a moment, not long enough to be a hesitation, just long enough that she knew he had noticed. Then he sat, wrapped both hands around the cup the way he always did when the morning was cold. She went back to the stove. The boy looked up from his plate. "I told her your name," he said to the man. The man looked at the boy, then at the counter, then at his cup. "I gathered," he said. She kept her back to both of them, moved the skillet, set a plate of salt pork to warm at the edge of the heat. Nothing in the room changed. The crow outside made a sound, and then went quiet. The boy ate his cornbread in pieces, methodical, the way he always did. Steam came off the coffee. She did not offer the name back to herself, did not try it out in her thinking, the way some women might. She simply had it now. A practical piece of information, like knowing the bread needed another quarter hour, like knowing the stovepipe would need clearing before autumn. She set it aside the way she set most things aside, without ceremony, in a place where she could find it later. When she finally set his plate down, she did it without comment. He said nothing either. The crow came back to the porch rail outside and stayed a while. The job came from a man named Pruitt, who stopped at the cookhouse counter 3 days running before he said what he was after. He was a rancher, east of town, 3 miles out past where the road turned to grass. He had post holes that needed setting, fence line that had gone soft over the winter. 2 weeks' work, he said. Maybe less if the ground cooperated. He made the offer to the room more than to any one person. He was that kind of man. But his eyes settled on Caleb at the end of the bench, and Caleb set down his cup. "I can do that," he said. Pruitt nodded once, told him to be out at first light the following day. That was all. When Pruitt left, the boy looked up from his cornbread. "That's Pruitt's ranch," he said, as though this were important information. "He's got a crow that follows the fence line." He said this with the authority of someone who had confirmed it personally. Caleb looked at him a moment. "I believe you," he said. The woman had said nothing through any of it. She had kept to the stove, moving things that did not particularly need moving. But when Caleb stood and reached for his hat, he said it without looking at her directly. "I'll still be in for breakfast." Each morning, she turned just enough to acknowledge she had heard him, not enough to show what she did with it. "Coffee's ready at first light," she said. Same tone she used for everything. Same tone she would have used to tell him the price of salt. He nodded. He reached for his hat from the peg at the door, and then he stopped. He had hung it on the nail again. He had not thought about it, had not made a decision about it. He had simply come through the door on the second or third morning, and his hand had found the nail the way a hand finds a familiar knob in the dark. He had not noticed he was doing it until now, holding the hat and looking at the small iron hook. She had seen it. He could tell by the slight stillness in her shoulders. He put the hat on and went out. She did not move for a moment after the door closed. Then she took the skillet from the edge of the heat and set it on the cooler part of the iron. The boy scraped the last of his cornbread across his plate and set his fork down with the particular satisfaction of a 9-year-old who has cleaned things thoroughly. "Will he be back tomorrow?" the boy asked. "He said so," she said. The boy considered this, then stood and pushed in the bench with both hands. Outside, the crow was back on the porch rail. She did not look at the nail. She went back to work. The 2 weeks turned without ceremony. He finished the section of fence line the ranch foreman had marked out, and the foreman walked it, tested 3 posts with his boot, and told him there were more, twice as many. He could stay on or move. He stayed. The ride in each morning was 3 miles of open ground, flat and cold before sunrise, the horse picking its way along the rut track while the sky went from black to the particular gray-blue that comes just before color returns to things. He was at the cookhouse before 6 most days. She had the coffee ready before he asked. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Sometime in the 3rd week, the general store owner, a man with a gray beard, trimmed close, and the deliberate economy of someone who measured everything twice, gave a single nod as Caleb crossed the threshold to buy lamp oil. Not a nod of greeting exactly, more the nod of a man acknowledging a fact that has been established. Caleb nodded back and said nothing. He did not think much of it. She thought of it the following morning when she watched the same man pause in front of her window and lift 2 fingers off his hat brim at her, the way he had not done since her husband was alive, and there was a man to extend the gesture toward. She turned back to the stove. The blacksmith said 6 words to him on a Thursday, that you're roan at the post, and when Caleb said yes, the blacksmith looked at the horse a moment longer and said, "Good feet," and went back inside. But he had said it. There had been a conversation of sorts, and the town had registered it the way small towns register everything, silently, completely, and with long memory. She noticed these things. She had lived here 4 years alone, and she had learned to read the social temperature of Harlan's Crossing the way a woman learns to read weather, not from what was said, but from what shifted. He did not notice them yet. He was still a man accustomed to invisibility, still slightly surprised each morning when she set the cup down without being asked. On a Friday, she set the cup down and beside it, without comment, a slice of dried apple pie, not at the end of the bench nearest the door. At his end, she went back to the counter before he sat. He looked at it for a moment. He ate the beans, the salt pork, the cornbread. He drank half the coffee. Then he pulled the pie toward him and ate it slowly, the way a man eats something he did not expect to have. She did not look at him while he ate it. He did not say anything when he stood to go. Outside, the crow was on the rail again. The merchant came in on a Wednesday, mid-morning, driving a flat wagon loaded with bolts of cloth and hardware tin. He was a large man with a red face, and the particular ease of someone who had learned long ago that conversation was a tool of commerce. He sat at the middle of the bench and ordered eggs and coffee, and had opinions about the road conditions south of Pueblo. He ate with appetite and talked between bites, addressing no one in particular and everyone available. The drifter was at the far end. He had come in earlier than usual that morning, before the boy from the livery arrived, and he was most of the way through his second cup when the merchant settled in. He had not invited the conversation. He rarely did. But he was not a man who looked away from people, and the merchant, sensing an audience of any kind, turned toward him. "How long you been working out this way?" the merchant asked. Meaning the country generally. Meaning what sort of passing through is this? The drifter set his cup down. He was quiet for a moment. Not reluctant, just genuinely calculating. A man who has moved so long that duration has lost its usual shape, who measures time in seasons and fence lines and faces rather than months. 6 weeks, he said. He said it the way a man says a number he did not expect to arrive at, slightly careful with it, turning it over once before he let it go. The merchant nodded and said something about the ranch work east of town, about how the grass came in late this year. The drifter answered plainly, 2 men briefly sharing information about practical things, which is the only kind of conversation either of them trusted. At the far end of the counter, she was working through a bowl of cornmeal, pressing it through a cloth to clear the grit. She did not look up when the merchant came in. She did not look up when he started talking. She had long since learned to let the noise of a room move past her without catching. But she heard the number. 6 weeks. She set her spoon down. It was a small thing, a pause of perhaps 2 seconds before she picked it up again and continued. She did not turn. She did not lift her eyes toward the bench. She just stopped, briefly, in the middle of something ordinary. 6 weeks was the fence job doubled. 6 weeks was every morning except one Sunday when the rain came in hard enough to close the roads. 6 weeks was the dried apple pie and the second cup of coffee, and the crow on the rail and the nail, just inside the door, where he had not yet hung anything. She picked her spoon back up. Outside, the wagon horse shifted its weight on the wet boards of the rail, and the sound came through the thin wall like a quiet knock. The 7th week ended on a Thursday. She knew it before he said anything, which was not difficult, because he did not say anything. He came through the door at the same hour, same pace, same quiet arrangement of himself at the far end of the bench. The canvas bag set down beside his boots, the tin cup already in his hand before she reached for the pot. But his hands were clean. Not the clean of a man who had washed up carefully before coming in. The clean of a man who had not worked. No chalk-dry grit in the creases of his knuckles. No grease along the heel of his palm from the post-driver handle. She had seen his hands every morning for nearly 7 weeks, and she knew what work looked like on them. And this morning, it was not there. She poured the coffee without pausing. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the grain of the table. She went back to the stove. The boy came in a few minutes later, dropped onto his usual spot at the middle of the bench with his cap pushed sideways, and his shoes already muddy in the way that only happened when he'd been at the creek before breakfast, which he was not supposed to be. He said something about a frog. The drifter looked at him. The boy demonstrated the size of the frog, with his hands held about 10 inches apart, which was optimistic. The drifter said nothing, but he looked at the hands and then back at the boy's face, and something around his eyes moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. She plated a full breakfast and set it down. He ate it without any change in his expression, but slowly, more slowly than usual. The other men came in and went. The bench cleared. The sound of chairs and boots and the scrape of crockery settled into quiet. He stayed. She washed the plates in the basin and stacked them on the shelf and wiped down the far end of the counter. She worked through the ordinary motions of the morning without hurrying and without filling the silence with anything. He sat with the second cup she had poured him, and she did not know if he was thinking about the work that had ended, or the work he would need to find, or something else entirely, and she did not ask. The half-hour passed slowly. When he finally rose, he gathered his bag and settled his hat and went to the door. He paused there, not long, not in a way that meant anything she could name, and then he went through it and out into the late morning where the sun had finally come over the roof of the general store and was laying a line of pale light across the mud of the street. The days after the fence work ended moved differently than the days before. He was still there each morning. That much did not change, but the shape of the hours after breakfast was different now. Less determined, slower at the edges. She watched him when she could do it without being obvious about it, and she noticed that he moved through the town with the same unhurried economy as always, but that something in him had loosened slightly, the way a man loosens when he has stopped pretending he knows what comes next. September arrived the way it always does in eastern Colorado. Quietly, then all at once. The mornings went cold overnight. She had begun leaving the small stove burning a little longer, and the cookhouse held the warmth well into the forenoon. She woke one Tuesday to find the lights still gray and the air carrying the first real bite of the coming season. She dressed and came down the narrow back staircase and pushed through into the cookhouse to start the fire. Her foot came down on the step outside the door. It was solid. She stopped. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the doorframe and looked down at the board that had been soft and unreliable for the better part of 2 months. She had been meaning to see to it, had put it off, had learned to step over it slightly without thinking. It was flush now, set true. She could feel the difference, even through the sole of her boot. She looked at it for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she pushed through into the cookhouse and got the fire started and began the cornbread. He was already at the bench when the other men came in. He had his cup and he was looking at the window the way he sometimes did in the mornings when the light was doing something worth noting. She could not have said what he was watching, only that he was not watching nothing. The other men sat and talked and ate and paid and went. The bench thinned. She sliced the cornbread and brought a piece to his end of the bench without him asking. She set it on the counter in front of him and went back to the stove. He looked at it. He did not say anything about the step, and she did not say anything about the step. She refilled his cup when it was low, and he moved it a fraction of an inch toward her when she reached for it, which was as close as either of them came to the subject all morning. Outside, a thin wind had come up and was moving the dust in the street in slow, indifferent circles. Summer was done with them now. The season was turning and the town was settling into the long quiet of what came after. The boy came in on a Wednesday, same as always, same cup of milk and same end of the bench. He ate his eggs without much comment and then sat watching the drifter, the way 9-year-olds watch things that interest them, directly, without the social sense to look away. He asked the question between bites. Did he plan on leaving when winter came? The drifter looked at his cup, not a glance, a long, settled look, as if the answer might be resting somewhere at the bottom of it. The boy waited with the patience of someone who did not yet know that some questions cost something to answer. Across the counter, she had gone still. Her hands were on the dishcloth and she was not moving it. She was looking at the window above the dry goods shelf, or appearing to. The light there had not changed. There was nothing to look at. He said he did not know yet. The boy seemed to find this acceptable. He finished his milk and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and slid off the bench and went out the way he came in, screen door swinging once behind him. The cookhouse was quiet. She started moving the dishcloth again. He drank the last of his coffee and set the cup down gently, the dented side facing in toward the counter the way it always did. He got his coat from the peg near the door and shrugged into it one arm at a time. neither hurrying nor taking longer than necessary. He reached for the nail on his way out. He stopped. His hat was in his hand. He stood there for a moment with it, and then he hung it on the nail and went out the door without it. She heard his boots on the new step. She heard them cross the porch and descend and continue on until the mud of the street swallowed the sound. She did not look at the hat for a while. She washed the cups and wiped down the counter, and covered the remaining cornbread with a cloth. She swept the floor near the door, where the men tracked in grit each morning. She did all of it slowly, the way a person does when they are not ready to look at the thing they are waiting to look at. When she finally did, it was just a hat on a nail. Brown felt, a little worn at the brim, the crease down the center shaped by years of the same hand, setting it the same way. She blew out the lantern at the end of the night, the way she always did, moving from one end of the cookhouse to the other. The hat was still there when the last light went out. The cold came in the night. She knew it before she opened her eyes. The quality of the silence, the way the air sat differently against the walls of the room above the cookhouse. She lay still for a moment, the way she sometimes did, not holding on to sleep, just letting it go at its own pace. Then she got up and dressed in the dark, the way she had done every morning for 4 years. She did not light the lamp right away. She went to the window first, as she sometimes did when the season was changing, and looked out at the street. The frost had come. It lay across the boards of the porch and the rail, and the packed earth of the road, in a thin white coat that made everything look like it had been drawn rather than built. The sky was still dark at the edges, but going pale at the center, and her breath showed when she exhaled against the glass. She saw the chair. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to. It was a plain chair, the same plain wood as the one already out there, and it had been set beside it, with the care of someone who had thought about where exactly it ought to go. Not too close, not too far, at an angle that suggested two people sitting together, in no particular hurry to be anywhere else. She went back to the stove. She fed the fire and set the water on, and measured the coffee the way she always did, by feel now more than count. She got the cornbread going, and found the salt pork, and laid it in the pan. The sounds of the cookhouse came back around her, the creak of the floorboards, the small percussion of the cast iron, the breath of the fire catching and settling. She did not think about the chair in any direct way. She thought about the morning the way she always did, what needed doing, what order to do it in. When the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups and carried them to the porch. The cold took her breath the moment she stepped through the door. She set 1 cup on the rail and then the other, spacing them the width of 2 people standing apart. The frost cracked faintly under her boots. Out at the edge of the street, a horse moved somewhere she couldn't see, and the sound carried in the cold air the way sounds do in October, farther than they should. She went back inside. His hat was on the nail. She returned to the stove and turned the salt pork and checked the cornbread and listened to the town waking up in its slow way around her, one sound at a time. The chair was still there when the light came full. It stayed.